Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to Reading Carl Schmitt. Today we're looking at Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy or Parliamentarism. We're looking at Chapter 1, which is titled Democracy and Parliamentarism. Okay? So let's go right to it. The history of political and state theory in the 19th century could be summarized with a single phrase: the triumphal march of democracy. That's, this is the whole point. The big note of citations. I'm not going to be using the notes here. If you want to go check notes, you can go do it. The notes are fantastic and they're like extensive. Um, no state in the Western European cultural world withstood the extension of democratic ideas and institutions. When, even where powerful social forces defended themselves, such as the Prussian monarchy, no intellectual force that could have defeated democratic beliefs reached outside its own circles of its adherents. In other words, the democratic theory kind of like, in other words, that it wasn't popular. In other words, that even the Prussian monarchies, only the inherents of this argument, Prussian monarchy, still believe that this claim was better than democracy. Okay? Progress and the extension of democracy was equated, and the anti-democratic resistance was considered an empty defense. The protection of historical outmoded things and a struggle of the old with the new. Every epoch of political and state thought has conceptions which appear evident to it in a specific sense, and even if so, with many misunderstandings and mythologizings, are without anything further plausible to the great masses. Every epoch of political and state theory, the development is by this is saying there's been the development of state theory, political theory, and state theory has certain developmental moments, epochs, periods of agreement. And he said what he says here is very interesting. He says that and the conceptions which appear evident to it in any specific in the specific sense, and even if also with many misunderstandings and mythologizings, right, are without anything further plausible to many. In other words, therefore, the masses think this is plausible, even if it's been mythologized or misunderstood. Okay, in the 19th century and into the 20th, this kind of obviousness and evidence was certainly on the side of democracy. Ranke called the idea of popular sovereignty the most powerful conception of the age, and its conflict with the principle of monarchy, uh, the dominant current of the century. In other words, in the 19th century, that whole tension was the tension between this monarchy, the older tradition of the monarchy, and democracy. Maybe the French Revolution, the ancien regime was monarchy, right? And that the popular sovereignty was what the rights of man meant, right? So since then, the conflict has ended with the victory of democracy. Since 1830, all major French thinkers with a sense of intellectual trends, has believed increasingly that Europe must, in an unavoidable destiny, become democratic. This was most profoundly felt in the expression by Alex de Tocqueville. I can never say his name. Guyots was also guided by this idea, though he was also afraid of democratic chaos. The disposition of Providence appeared to have decided in favor of democracy. There was a frequently repeated image of this, the flood of democracy against which there seemed to have been no dams in 1789. The most impressive description of this development, given by Taine in his English literary history, was formed under Goethe's influence. Goethe is a very important French 19th century kind of the French Revolution historical thinker. That's you can get some of his many of his books in Liberty Fund books. have many of his classics, and you can probably find a lot of his stuff translated on Google Books too. So it was influence. That in many ways, Goetz and Tocqueville are kind of like the kind of things who both kind of have a kind of like, oh, they think democracy is inevitable, but they have problems that they fear. Right? Um, one judged the development in many ways. Tocqueville, with his aristocratic fear of the fear of bourgeois mankind, the collection of timid and industrious individuals. Goetz hoped to tame this terrible force. Michelet had an enthusiastic belief in the natural goodness of people. Rain felt the disgust of the educated and the skepticisms of the historian. And the socialists were convinced that they were the true heirs of democracy. So these are the different forces, like he's saying. So um, Tocqueville feared the bourgeoisie. This Goyet's hoped that they could tame it. Michel thought about the following her soul in many ways. Michelet um, does this, and whereas Raines felt the disgust of the educated and the skepticism of a historian. And the socialists were, so therefore there's like one, two, three, five points, groups here, and 5 points of view, and they're different things. The socialists thought that they were the true heirs. Right? It is proof. It is proof of the remarkable self-evidence of democratic ideas that even socialism, which appeared as a new idea of the 19th century, decided in favor of an alliance with democracy. Many had tried to form a coalition between democracy and established monarchies because the liberal bourgeoisie was a common enemy of conservative monarchy and the proletarian masses. This tacit cooperation expressed itself in different alliances and even enjoyed some success in England under Disraeli. But in the last analysis, it worked again to the advantage of democracy alone. In Germany, hold on, I get some water. My throat. In Germany, there remained in this respect pious wishes and a romantic socialism. The socialist organization of the mass of workers here took over progressive democratic ideas so exactly that they appeared to be protagonists of these ideas in Germany, far outstripping bourgeois democrats. And they had the double task of realizing both social and democratic demands at the same time. And now this is SDP, particularly Social Democratic Party, and things like this. This is idea in that sense. This is the German idea of socialism. Achieved it and radicalized it. They had some kind of communism, but um, one could regard both as identical because one believed they constituted progress in the future. Thus, democracy appeared to have the self evidence of an irresistible advancing and expanding force, so long as it was essentially a polemical concept, that is, the negation of established monarchy. Democratic convictions could be joined to and reconciled with various other political aspirations. But to the extent that it was realized, democracy was seen to serve many masters and not in any way to have a substantial, clear goal. So therefore, democracy was just simply a process or something like this that served many masters, not have a specific goal in that sense, except in light of removing monarchy, right? That's the only thing in that sense, right? Monarchical rule. As the most important opponent, the monarchical principle disappeared. Democracy itself lost its substantive precision and shared the fate of every polemical concept. So the polemical means it was against. Polemical, this is a concept. Concepts are either pure in that sense or a polemical. That means it was a concept done in contrast or opposition to something else. And he's saying that democracy, it was the idea of was originally conceived as a polemical concept, as against the rule of the ancient regime, or the ruler of the monarch, or the ruler of personal rule. It was the people's rule, right? The people rule, popular rule, popular sovereignty in that sense, right? At first, democracy appeared in an entirely obvious alliance, even identity with liberalism and freedom. In social democracy, it joined with socialism. So first, the original alliance with with bourgeoisie, right, against the monarchs, was liberalism and freedom, right, and then a social democracy, socialism. The success of Napoleon III and the result of the Swiss referenda demonstrated that it could easily be conservative and reactionary, just as Proudhon prophesied. If all political tendencies could make use of democracy, then this proved that it had no political context and was only an organizational form. Right? This is the point, that it had no political context. It was only organizational form. And if one regarded it from the perspective of some political programs that one hoped to achieve with the help of democracy, then one had to ask oneself what value democracy itself had merely as form. Okay? The attempt to give democracy a content by transferring it from the political to the economic sphere did not answer the question. Such transfers from the political into the economic are to be found in numerous publications. English Guild Socialism calls itself economic democracy, a well-known analogy of the constitutional state with constitutional factories has been extended in every possible direction. In truth, this signifies an essential change in the concept of democracy because the political point of view cannot be transferred into an economic relationship, as long as freedom of contract and civil law holds sway in the economy. Max Weber had already argued in his article Parlament und Rechtsstaat und Neuralagie Deutschland, right, in Germany, right. It was I don't even know how to pronounce the guy in 1918. Again, this is right near when he dies. He dies very hero, 1920, right. This is one of his articles, Parliamentary this in Germany, modern. Okay, yeah, this is the famous Parliament and Democracy in the newly organized Germany, right? Parliament and I think Regierung, People's Rule, and or this newly organized Germany. This is again talking about what's happening after the war, right immediately after the war, the breakup of the German Empire, the collapse, the so-called Weimar Constitution, right? That the state now had already argued in his article that the state was sociologically just another large business, and that an economic administrative system, a factory, and a state are today no longer essentially different. So this is like kind of like that. It's basically a business state in that sense, right? And I think this is a little bit also. This is the view this business state. Um, State as corporation, I'm not sure. This is not original with Weber, and I think this is something. What is it? What's his name? Maitland in the 1890s, early teens, argued about the crown as corporation, the state as corporation in that sense. Um, and I can see that maybe Weber's getting this, and I think he's trying to say that's not economic, that it's the state was sociologically just another large organization, business business administrative system, a factory, and that the state are today no system fit and the state are today no longer essentially different. From that, Kelsen drew the conclusion, perhaps too soon, in his uh, um, lesson in what democracy, 1921, democracy work, that for that reason, organization problems are fundamentally the same in both cases. In democracy, is a question not only of the state but also of commercial enterprises. Okay, we've been having interruptions with things. So, again, Kelson's Nature and Value of Democracy, 1921, right? He says that this is the same of these things, and I think this is Schmitt saying that no, there's a difference between business entity and a political entity, and therefore Weber, I think Weber kind of hit. I think Weber was hitting on something, but then got it wrong in Schmitt's view. That, in other words, that the idea that there's no difference between at the organizational level of these two things. Schmitt wants to argue that there is a difference in organizational level. But a political form of organization ceases to be political if it is, like a modern economy, based on private law. So therefore, but a political form of organization ceases to be political if it is like the modern economy is based on private law. So if it's based on private law, then it's not political really anymore. There are certainly there are certain analogies between a monarch, the absolute master, and the state and the capitalist, who naturally in a completely different sense is the absolute master of his business. There are possibilities on both sides for participation by subordinates, but the form and context of authority, publicity, and representation are essentially different. This is Schmitt's deconstruction of the claim. Here, Schmitt is saying that, okay, a capitalist running the business and the thing, okay, it looks like this, but they're not the same. They have similarities, but in other words, he says what they're both kind of bosses, right? Absolute masters in this sense, right? But and there's levels of what both sides for participation by subordinates, but the form and the content of authority, publicity, and representation are essentially different. Finally, if it would also contradict now, it would also contradict every rule of economic thought to apply, by the way of an analogy, political forms, which have been created on the very different assumption to modern economic conditions, or to use a well-known economic image, to transfer the construction of a superstructure onto an essentially different substructure. Okay, so in other words, he's saying that it's just not once you, in other words, the nature of economic thinking about markets and how markets work and this, production and things like this, the rules of these things are different in character than political rule. And therefore, if you do this, it's going to be, he says, on a very different assumption. In other words, the assumptions by which political form rests are on a different basis of assumption than the, the nature of economic theory works. So he says, you're throwing Marx, saying, you're kind of making fun of Marx a little bit. Well-known economic image to transfer the construction of a superstructure onto an essentially a different substructure. Okay. In other words, the superstructure is on a different substructure. In other words, incompatible substructure, right? The various nations or socio-economic groups who organize themselves democratically have the same object, the people, only in the abstract. So therefore, this is very interesting. And I think this is a very good point by Schmitt, that the various nations or social groups who organize themselves democratically have the same subject, the people, in the abstract. They're abstract. In concreto, the masses are sociologically and psychologically heterogeneous. Schmitt, yes, absolutely right. In other words, the masses by themselves are not homogeneous. The masses will. This is something Aristotle makes a very clear point in Book 4 of the Politics, and also Book 6 of the Politics, when he deals with particularly Chapter 4 of Book 6, where he deals with the different multitudes, right? The farming multitude, in other words, the physical laboring multitude, the pastoral multitude, and the artisan multitude. That these are different fundamental multitudes, and the commercial multitude too. These are different multitudes and I think the commercial and the artisans intersect to a great degree. Whereas the laborers only have their bodies, their physical bodies as their labor, and they're the worst, they're the lowest of this. They have the least, and therefore the most slave-like. Aristotle argues, and therefore this is very different. He says the masses are sociologically and psychologically heterogeneous. A democracy can be militant or pacifist, absolutist or liberal, centralized or decentralized, progressive or reactionary, and again, different at different times without ceasing to be a democracy. Again, Schmitt is absolutely brilliant on this point that democracies can be different things. In other words, it can be liberal, it can be absolutist, it can be centralized. They're still democracies, okay? We have a bad tendency. We think all democracy is liberal democracy, and only liberal democracy is democracy. And anything that is not liberal democracy is not democracy. You hear this. This is the crap that comes out of the elites today and the so-called intellectuals, educated people, and democratic theorists who are crying about our democracy. Our poor democracy is under threat because these masses, these undesirables, and they're being ruled by demagogues, man, because they're so stupid. Well, Aristotle said, listen, that's true that the weakest ones can be manipulated, but they're still democracy, baby. um, Now, this is the problem about this. I think this is where Schmitt is a good thing. From these facts, it stands to reason that one cannot give democracy content by meaning or of transferring or of a transfer into an economic sphere. In other words, you can't just make it by turning it into an economic. It does not change the meaning. The democracy is about first and foremost a process. It's a mechanism of process and organization, and it doesn't have a context by transferring into economics. What remains then democracy? For its definition, one has a string of identities. It belongs to the essence of democracy that every and all decisions which are taken are only valid for those who themselves decide. Self-rule, right? Self-rule, rule of the people. In other words, repeat this. Essential for democracy that all decisions are only valid for those who themselves decide. They are that the outvoted minority must be ignored. Only causes that the outvoted minority must be ignored. In this only causes theoretical and superficial difficulties. In reality, even this rests on the identity that consistently recurs in democratic logic and on essential democratic argument, as it seems as will be seen immediately, that the will of the outvoted minority is in truth identical with the will of the majority. Rousseau's fundamentally cited argument in social contract are fundamental for democratic thought and ultimate conform to the ancient tradition here. Right? It can be found almost literally in Locke. In democracy, the citizen will all agree that in democracy, a citizen even agrees to the law that is against his own will. For the law is the general will, and in turn, the will of the free citizen. Thus, a citizen never really gives his consent to a specific content, but rather in abstractio, in the larger sense, right, to the result that evolves out of the general will. And he votes only so that the vote out of which one can know this general will can be calculated. So a citizen never really gives his consent to a specific content, but rather to this abstracted result that evolve out of the general will, as he votes so that the votes out of which one can know what the general will it can be calculated. If the result deviates from the intentions of those individuals voting, then the outvoted know they have mistaken the content of the general will. This only proves that I have made a mistake, and that what I believed to be the general will was not so. Right? This is, and because, as Rousseau emphatically continues, the general will conforms to true freedom, then the outvoted were not free. With this Jacobin logic, one can, it is well known, justify the rule of a minority over the majority. So, in other words, and because, as Rousseau emphatically considered, general conforms to the true freedom, then the outvoted were not free. That's an interesting problem, right? With this Jacobian logic, it is well known justify the rule of a minority over the majority, even while appealing to democracy, right? This logic, a minority can, because it's older, because, but the essence of democratic principle is preserved, namely, the assertion of an identity between the law and the people's will. For an abstract logic, it merely makes no difference whether one identifies the will of the majority or the will of the minority with the will of the people. If it can never be absolutely unanimous will of all citizens, it can never be the unanimous will of all citizens, including those not eligible to vote. Right? This is that weird other problem, right? That, okay, maybe, but those people are not eligible. They don't. We don't know what they really think. So he kind of problematizes the general will here in that sense. That there is a general will, but it's when they make it out, it's that remember the heterogeneous character of the people may lead to what is the problem here, and that majority principle. He basically lays that, okay, that's the case, right? We follow the Rousseauian logic, and it has to be unanimous, but it's not going to be unanimous. Therefore, what's happening is then the people, the ones who don't agree, that's why you have to force them to be free in that sense, right? Otherwise, because they're not free, right? And then with this line here, because the Rousseau emphasis continued, right? The general will conforms to true freedom, right? The general will. So what happens? The people, can the majority be mistaken? Can these people, in their understanding of what should be done, could be mistaken? What the general will is? Well, yes. The argument is that the people, the minority, is mistaken. The argument is, right, and that leads us to a problem here, right? And and that leads us to this logic, he says, of the Jacobinian logic, where the rule of the minority over majority, while even appealing to democracy, right? Because they know what is best, right? So let's continue the next line here. Even if franchise is given to an increasing number of people in a ever broader extension, then that is a symptom of the endeavor to realize the identity between the state and the people. In other words, the extension, realize the identity between the state and the people. Okay, at its basis, there is a popular conception about the preconditions on which one accepts this identity as real. But that does not change anything about the fundamental conception that all democratic arguments rest logically on a series of identities. So he says that, in other words, that, there's a problem here. We do this as a symptom of trying to understand what is the state and the people, and what is the border of this, what is the identity between these two things, right? And but that does not change anything about the fundamental conception that all democratic arguments rest logically on a sense of identities. In this sense, in this series belongs the identity of the governed and the governing, the sovereign and the subject. So these are identities. In the series belong the identity of the governed and the governed, the subject, the sovereign and the subject, the identity of the subject and the object of state authority, the identity of the people the identity of the people with their representative in Parliament, the identity of the state and the current voting population, the identity of the state and the law, and finally, the identity of the qualitative numeral majority or unanimity, and the qualitative the justice of the laws, right? So the qualitative, the qualitative, the numerical democracy, right, of the majority or unanimity, and the qualitative, the justice of the laws. So these are the series of identities, right? These things that are posed. And actually, this is what is it? We have this a number of series. So first is the governed and the governing, right? That's one. Sovereign and subject, two. The identity of the subject and the object of state authority. So the who is the subject, but then what is the purpose of state authority? Three. The identity of the people with their representative in Parliament. Okay. So the people and their representative. That's the fourth. The identity of the state and the current voting population. Okay, what kind of state and the voting population? Next one. The identity of that's the fifth one, right? It's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then the identity of the state and the law. That's the sixth, and finally the seventh is between the qualitative and the quantitative. So that's how we have the seven. We have seven. I think seven. Yeah, seven. What is the word? Um, series. Seven series of these different identities in relation to each other. All these identities are not palatable reality, are not palatable, pal, pal, palatable reality. All of these entities are not palatable reality. In other words, but rest on the recognition of the identity. So not just simply this, palatable means tasting reality. It's something that you can physically taste, but rather it's recognition. It's not something that you can touch and taste, but rather something that you have to recognize. Okay, identity of the identity. It is not a matter of something actual, equal legally, politically, or sociologically, but rather of identification. So again, this is not something that's actually equal legally, politically, or sociologically, but rather of identification. Extensions of suffrage, the reduction of the electoral terms of office, the introduction and extension of referenda and initiative. In short, everything that one identifies as an institution of direct democracy or a tendency towards it. And all those things which, as has been just mentioned, are governed by the notion of an identity. Those things, those institutions, those structures. He says that the extension of suffrage, the reduction of electoral terms of office, the introduction of an extension of referendum initiative, all these things are about identifies as institutions of direct democracy or tendency towards it, right? And all of these things, as has just been mentioned, are governed by the notion of an identity that are in consequence democratic, right? But they can never reach an absolute direct identity that is actually present at every moment. So therefore, this is not always something that can reach that identity that is present every moment. At distance, a distance always remains between real equality and results of identification. So real equality versus the way these kind of processes operate are never going to be the same. There's always going to be a distance between them. He's saying. The will of the people is, of course, always identical with the will of the people. Okay? The will of the people is always whether a decision comes from the yes or no of millions of voting papers, or from a single individual who has the will of the people, even without a ballot, or from the people acclaiming things in some way. So he's saying that the will of people equals the will of people, regardless of the means. And all of these are equally, in other words, millions of yes and no's on millions of voting papers. That's one. Of a single individual who has the will of the people without even a ballot. Okay. Two, or from people people claiming in some way. People. Okay. These three ways. These three different ways are equally the will of the people, right? And that's a problematic thing because the will of the people equals the will of the people. Everything depends on how the will of the people is formed. The ancient dialectic in the theory of the will of the people has still not been resolved. So that this problem, this question of how this will, we have not resolved the question of how is the will of the people resolved. The minority might express the true will of the people. The people might be deceived. One has long been familiar with the techniques of propaganda and the manipulation of public opinion, right? This dialectic is as old as democracy itself and does not begin in any way and does not in any way begin with Rousseau or the Jacobins. Okay, this is that problem. This is even Aristotle. Aristotle and Plato says this too, right? They can be wrong. They can be deceived. They can be like this. This is a problem. Even at the beginning of modern democracy, one comes to across the remarkable contradiction that the radical Democrats understood their democratic radicalism as a selection criteria that distinguishes them from others as the true representatives of the people will. So the in other words, the radical Democrats say, we are the true Democrats. We really represent the people as well. And you, who are not a radical Democrat, you don't represent the people. Okay? This is wonderful. Okay? In other words, it comes across a remarkable contradiction that they understand this in that sense, right? From this, there arose in practice an extreme undemocratic exclusivity because only the representatives of true democracy were granted political rights. Okay, this is important. So, in other words, the undemocratic exclusivity, only representatives of true democracy were granted political rights. At the same time, a new aristocracy emerged. It is an old sociological phenomenon that repeats itself in every revolution. It did not appear first with the November Socialists in 1918, but showed itself everywhere in 1848 and those who were called all Republicans. It is entirely consistent to maintain that democracy can only be introduced from a people who really think democratically. The first direct democracy of modern period, the liberals of the Puritan Revolution, were not able to escape this democratic dialectic. Their leader, Lilliburn, wrote in his Legal Fundamental Principles of the People of England, 1649, that only the well affected should have voting rights, that the elected representatives of these well affected people must have legislative power completely in their hands, and that the Constitution must be a contract signed by the well affected. Under what is meant by well affected, that's a real problem, right? Democracy seems fated then to destroy itself in the problem of its formation of a will. That's the whole point. That the whole democratic democracy always problems of the will. What is a democrat? What is the will of the people? And it's the problem of formulating that will. That's why it's always said that he says fated to destroy itself. For radical Democrats, democracy is as such. Democracy as such has its own value without reference to the context of the politics pursued with the help of democracy. If the danger exists that democracy might be used in order to defeat democracy, then the radical Democrat has to decide whether to remain a Democrat against the majority or to give up his own position. As soon as democracy takes on the content of self-sufficient value, then one can no longer remain in the formal sense a Democratic at any price. Right? It is a remarkable fact that, and a necessity, but in no way an abstract dialectic or sophistical game. In other words, as soon as you take the process, it means that once you have a context, you cannot just be a Democrat. The thing that you want is more important than the process. Democracy is a process. The process is not the end. The end is the end, and that the process does not lead you to the end, then you reject the process, right? Or don't, this is that problem here, right? That's the whole problem. It is matter of fact and a necessity, but in no way an abstract dialectic or Swiss game. It often happens that Democrats are in the minority. It also happens that they decide on the basis of a supposedly democratic principle in favor of women's suffrage, and then have the experience that the majority of women do not vote democratically. Then the familiar program of people's education unfolds. Right? People can be brought to recognize their and express their own will correctly through right education. Right? You have to make the people think they know what they should not want. Right? This is the problem. The people want the people don't. The people, the process, like women who you get the franchise, but then the women then don't vote for Democrat, don't vote in the way Democrats want them to vote. And because this familiar program of this, people can be brought to recognize and express their own will correctly through the right education. This this means nothing else than the educator identifies his will, at least provisionally, with that of the people. Not to mention that the content of the education that the people will receive is also dedicated by the educator. Oh God, this is so great. I mean, this is wonderful. I mean, this he Schmitt in 1920 in the early 20s is predicting the way educators, like the whole problem of modern education, the woke educators, how they're corrupt educating the young. The educator now educates. We educate the young. And what happens is, well, it's the educator's view of democracy, what means democracy. In other words, this means nothing else but that the educator identifies his will, at least provisionally, with that of the people. Not to mention that the context of education that the pupil will receive is also dedicated by the educator. The consequence of this educational theory is a dictatorship that suspends democracy in the name of true democracy that is still to be created. The consequence of this okay, this is the whole problem. This is again Schmitt. Oh God, I wished I could post this text. I wish I was able to cut and paste it. This is again one of the great lines. It always comes up with these great lines. This is why. Um, oh, remember when I read this a long time ago? That's why in my book I quote that line about the homogeneity and hegemony in the preface because it's that the consequence of this educational theory is a dictatorship that suspends democracy. Theoretically, this does not destroy democracy, but it is important to pay attention to it because it shows that dictatorship is not antithetical to democracy. Remember that. That is not antithetical to democracy. Even during a transitional period dominated by a dictator, a democratic identity can still exist, and the will of the people can still be the exclusive criteria. So Nazi Germany was a democracy. That's the problem, right? Even this, that the dictator can do this. This is, the dictator is going to be doing the will of the people. Again, this is the question: the will of the people, right? And the will of people can still be the exclusive criteria. It is then particularly noticeable that the single practical question affected by the question of identification, and specifically the question of who has control over the means with which the will of the people is to be constructed. The military and police force, propaganda, control of public opinion through the press, party organizations, assemblies, popular education, and schools. Now, these mechanisms are mechanisms by which what you do this. You have this single part question affected by the question of identification, of the question who has the control over the means with which the will of the people is to be constituted. So these are different things: police and military force, state organs, propaganda against state organs or institutions, that's it. Control popular opinion through the press, party organizations, assemblies, popular education in schools, in particular, only political power, which should come from the people's will, can form the people's will in the first place. Is that political power, which should come from the people's will, can only form the will of the people in the first place. So this is the interconnection contradiction. In other words, a political will is necessary to create the people's will, but the people's will, a political thing comes from the people's will. See, this is the interconnection contradiction that Schmitt points out. One can say today, faced with the expansion of democratic thought, that an identity with the will of the people has become so common a premise that it has ceased to be a political, that it ceased to be politically politically interesting, and that the conflict only concerns the means of identification of this thing. In other words, the real conflict is no longer about the will of the people, but the means of identifying the will of the people. In a sense, that the will of the people it's meaning it's no longer interesting. Rather, the conflict is about the means of identification of how that will emerges. Right? Who creates it? What is it? It will be foolish to deny the generally accepted agreement here. Not only because today there are no kings who have the courage to declare openly that, if necessary, they will retain on the throne against the will of the people, but also because every single political power can hope by some means to achieve this identification one day. So everyone can hope that they can get the identification of people's will. So therefore, because that they are all, in other words, not only because there's not a king strong enough to say, I'm going to ignore what the people say, but but every significant political power can hope by some means to achieve this identification of what they are with the people's will. For that reason, none has an interest in denying the democratic identity. On the contrary, all are more interested in knowing how to confirm it. They're not interested in denying it. They're only concerned how they confirm it. The rule of the Bolshevik government in the Soviet Union certainly counts as the notable example of disregard for democratic principles. Nevertheless, its theoretical arguments remain within the democratic current, with exceptions that will be mentioned in Chapter 4, and only uses modern criticisms and democratic experience for the misuse of political democracy. What counts as democracy in Western European states today is for them only trickery of capital economic dominance over press and parties. That is, the lie of falsely educated popular will. So therefore, this is the Western democracy, Western European states. This is just a trickery of capitalist economic dominance over press and parties. And therefore, it's that people have been false consciousness. Right? Communism would be the first true democracy. Apart from its economic foundations, this is in its structure the old Jacobin argument, right? This is apart from economic. This is the old Jacobin argument in that sense, right? It's the will of people. From the opposite side, a royal publicist can express his contempt for democracy with the tenet: prevailing opinion today is so stupid that with the correct approach, it could be brought to renounce its own power. This means that it could be brought to demand an act of it can be brought to demand an act of common sense from something that lacks sense. But isn't it always possible to find this absurd motive for an act which is not in itself at all absurd? Now, I don't know the quote he's quoting here. He's quoting something here. I always have to be careful with this. Charles Maurras, I think he's quoting. Okay, let's go. I'm sorry, I should have stopped and done this. I don't like using. Yeah, it's Charles Maurras. Um, for an act which is itself not at all absurd. There is mutual agreement on this on both sides. When the theorists of the Bolsheviks suspend democracy in the name of true democracy, and the enemies of democracy hope to deceive it, when then the one still assumes that democratic principles are theoretically correct, and the other that the democratic reality, the other that is democratic real supremacy that has to be reckoned with. Only Italian fascism seem to place no value on being democratic. With that exception, one must say that until now, the democratic principle has been universally accepted without contradiction. That is significant for, and I think this is interesting. Why does he think that the fascism has no care about democratic theory? That is an interesting point by Schmitt. I wonder what could he explain that. Why does no note here? Um, with the exception that with the exception that one must say that until now, the democratic principle has been universally accepted without contradiction, right? Except for the Italians, everything has been accepted. That is significant for the jurisprudence of public law. Neither the theory nor the practical practice of constitutional and international law could get along without a concept of legitimacy. And for that reason, it is important that the democratic concept of legitimacy today is, in fact, democratic. The development from 1815 until 1918 could be depicted as the development of the concept of legitimacy from dynamic to democratic legitimacy. The democratic principle must today claim an important importance analogous, something analogously important, claim an important analogous to that earlier possessed by the monarchy, right? The legitimacy of the monarchy. This point cannot be developed here, but it must at least be said that a concept that has legitimacy cannot change its subject without also changing its structure and its content. So, in other words, his idea that this is democratic has kind of become the basis by the legitimacy in that sense. He's saying here, as before the monarchical, just in the monarchical times, legitimacy was, I'm the rightful son, rightful heir. Right. The two different types of legitimacy exist today. Without the further, two different types of legitimacy exist today, without the concept ceasing to be indispensable or preserving its essential functions, even if jurists are little aware of these. Under public law, every government today is in general only provisional until it has been sanctioned by an assembly based on democratic principles. And every government that does not rest on this basis appears a usurpation. One assumes, although it does not follow from the principle of democracy, that the people are indeed mature and do not any longer need a Jacobin educational dictatorship. Prevailing legal conviction today and the concept of legitimacy, which rests on the demand for constitutional assembly, express themselves in one way regarding intervention of state one way regarding intervention in states' constitutional affairs. It is regarded as the fundamental difference between the Holy Alliance and the contemporary League of Nations, that the League of Nations only guarantees the external status quo of its members and refrains from intervening in their internal questions. But the same logic that led monarchical legitimacy to intervention, so too can intervention be justified by the appeal to the people's right to self-determination. So this is the people's right to self-determination. In other words, the League doesn't behave like the Holy League, right? The League of Nations does not. It's not going to interfere with internal questions. But he says the same logic that led the monarchals to this can also be leading to justified by an appeal to the people's right to self-determination. In numerous protests against the Soviet governments motivated by democratic convictions, the essential presumptions of the democratic principle of non-intervention, namely that a constitution must not contradict the will of the people, is recognizable. If a constitution is imposed and democratic principles are thus violated, then the people's right to self-determination may be restored. And this happens precisely through intervention. And intervention based on the concept of monarchical legitimacy is illegal in democratic theory only because it violates the principle of people's right to self-determination. By contrast, the restoration of a free self-determination achieved through intervention, the liberation of the people from a tyrant, cannot violate the principles of non-intervention in any way, but also create the preconditions for the principles. It creates the preconditions for the principles of non-intervention. Even a modern League of Nations based on democratic foundations needs a concept of legitimacy, and as a result of this, it also requires the possibility of intervention if the principle on which it is juristically based on should be damaged. Thus, for many judicial investigations today, one can begin with democratic maxims without risking a misunderstanding of having accepted all the definitions which constitute the political reality of democracy. So, in other words, for many juridical investigations today, one can begin with democratic maxims without risking the misunderstanding of having accepted all the definitions that constitute the political reality of democracy. Theoretically, and in critical times, also practically, critical times. So theoretically, and also in critical times, practically, democracy is helpless before the Jacobin government. That is, when faced with the authoritative identification of a minority as the people and the decisive transfer of the concept from the qualitative into the qualitative, the quantitative into the qualitative. Interest is then directed towards the creation and shaping of the popular will. And the belief that all power comes from the people takes on a meaning similar to the belief that all authoritative power comes from God. Okay? In other words, this idea that the problem here is that once I am a minority, I'm this, I believe I'm the real representative of the people's will, and the majority are mistaken, so I have to re-educate them and do this and this. And now this is how the people's will becomes like the will of God, right? That the people in belief that all power comes from the people takes on a meaning similar to the belief that all authoritative power comes from God. Both maxims permit various governmental forms of juristic consequences in political reality. A scientific study of democracy must begin with a particular aspect that I have called political theology. I should probably say political theology. Because parliamentarism and democracy were so closely aligned with each other in the 19th century that they could be accepted as synonymous, these comments on democracy must be made first. But democracy can exist without what one today calls parliamentarism, and parliamentarism without democracy. And dictatorship is just as little. Um, Dictatorship is just as little the definitive antithesis of democracy as dictatorship. Democracy is a dictatorship. So there was. This is very interesting. That originally democracy basically ends up. He gives up. This whole chapter really does not really talk about parliamentarism. He says, "Listen, what's happened was, and it's all about democracy. We needed to talk about democracy first. But why Because why? The idea was that democracy and parliamentarianism was historically, as the 19th century happened, it was synonymous, right? It was synonymous. It was kind of taught as synonymous to each other. But these comments, therefore, on democracy had to be done first, right? Because what? Because he says that democracy can exist without what we call parliamentarianism. Parliamentarianism without democracy. And dictatorship is just as little a distinctive antithesis as democracy is a dictatorship. So that's even a more interesting point that he's talked about. So he ends the chapter on this problem. It's been focusing mostly on the democratic basis of the tendency, what democracy means, the complexity of democracy, the contradictions of democracy, the problems of the concept of what is the people's will, all of these issues. And really has not touched on what parliament. We haven't really got a clear idea of what parliamentarianism. This is why I think in the next chapter he talks about parliamentarianism, the principle of parliamentarianism. So let's stop here. If you have any comments, questions, or issues you want to talk about, please put them below, and when I see them, I will address them. If you liked it, like it, hit the like button, share it, share with your friends, share it on your social media. If you're not subscribed, subscribe so you get the notifications and that things like this. I like to build the audience up. If you know someone who wants to subscribe, get other people to subscribe as well. Now, if you didn't like it, you thought something was wrong. Okay, you can hit the thumbs down, but say why you didn't like it in the comments. This is people say we don't have the thumb down anymore. Counting like this, people don't know. So this is one of the things that YouTube in the post 2016 world did was get rid of the negative ratios. So you can't know positive and negative. That's unfair. But if you have a negative comment, please put it below. Comment why, what I did wrong, what you didn't like. And maybe I can learn. Maybe if there's something I did here. Okay. Another thing you can do is you can follow me on social media links. The links are below. My social media links. If you want to follow, my academic social media is there too, so you can see more about me as the scholar. Another thing is, voila, what else? I need to go back. Sometimes you have to go back to your old videos and kind of fix this. I didn't put the academic stuff down there. If you want to help me do what I do, you can do so by Patreon and Subscribestar. That's how you can. One way you can help is be a patron or a patron, either on Patreon or Subscribestar. I don't have any big monies, and I don't think people really want to do it. People, you're not doing enough. You're not big enough for a site. I mean, I'm just like, I notice some sites. Whatever. My videos aren't that kind of flashy, right? You don't do that many kind of artistic stuff. And no, it's just me telling to you, and that's the best way to teach it like this. Another way you can help me is buy one of my books. The links are below. Well, that's it. We'll see you next time when we look at principles of parliamentarism. We'll do the reading Carl Schmitt's on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So have a good day. Take care. Bye-bye.